A woman is crossing a frozen plain with a baby tied to her chest. The wind cuts through animal hide. Her hands still work, her face still works, her feet do not. First they go numb, then they burn, then every step feels like striking stone with raw meat. She cannot stop walking. If she stops, the group loses distance. If the group loses distance, night catches them out here. And out here, cold does not kill cleanly. It starts at ground level. So why did ancient humans suddenly need socks? Here is the strange part. They did not need them because they had just discovered cold. They needed them because they had already solved almost everything else. For most of human history, humans probably did not have anything we would recognize as true foot insulation. Not knitted wool socks, not anything store-bought, but soft inner layers whose whole job was to keep feet warm, dry, and working seem to appear surprisingly late. That is odd, because feet look like the first body part you would protect. Rock, thorns, ice, parasites, wet ground. The landscape is constantly trying to punish them, and yet humans spent an astonishing stretch of time getting by with bare feet, toughened soles, or very simple wrappings. Then something changed. Not fashion, not comfort. A new kind of vulnerability. The awkward part is that ancient socks almost never survive. Fur decays, leather rots, fiber collapses back into dirt. If Ice Age humans wrapped their feet in soft liners or stuffed boots with grass, most of that evidence is gone. But feet survive, and feet change depending on the job they do. People who grow up habitually barefoot develop different feet from people who grow up inside footwear. The foot spreads wider, the toes splay more naturally. The bones reflect a life spent gripping, balancing, and pushing off without support. Put that same foot inside regular coverings for a lifetime, and the stress pattern changes. That shift is exactly what archaeologists begin seeing in later Ice Age humans. For a very long time, human feet still look like feet doing barefoot work. Then, later, more of them do not. That is enough to tell us something important. Humans did not begin seriously insulating their feet just because insulation felt nice. They began when older solutions stopped being good enough. So what changed? The obvious answer is cold. But cold by itself is not the whole story, because cold had existed for a very long time. Ice ages are older than sock-like insulation. Humans had already faced brutal weather long before the archaeological signal begins to shift. The real question is not why cold mattered. It is why cold started mattering more than the old workaround could handle. Part of the answer begins with a basic fact about us. We are tropical animals. Our species evolved in warm environments, and our bodies still show it. Bare skin, heavy sweating, long legs built for distance, feet built to flex, spread, grip, and dissipate heat efficiently. In warm landscapes, that works beautifully. A bare human foot is not a defect. It is a highly capable tool. Then humans kept walking north. Not into chilly weather, into winters our bodies had never been designed for. Ground that stayed frozen, snow that melted into slush by day, hide that got wet. Temperatures that dropped again at night and locked everything stiff. And feet have a special weakness in that world. Your core can be packed under fur. Your hands can be shoved into your armpits. Your face can turn away from the wind. Your feet stay pressed against the problem. Every step pushes them into snow, slush, mud, frozen ground. They lose heat downward and outward at the same time. They do not have much muscle mass to generate warmth. Blood flow can be reduced to protect the core. And once your feet stop functioning, the rest of you may as well be injured too. Bad foot protection limits hunting, migration, and winter travel. Once your feet fail, your range collapses. That alone would push humans toward better footwear. But there was an even nastier problem hiding inside the cold: wetness. Most people imagine snow as the enemy. Snow is often just the delivery system. Cold hurts, wetness finishes the job. Air is an insulator. Trap dry air around the skin, and you keep heat. Water ruins that instantly. Water pulls heat away far faster than air does. Once your foot covering gets damp, every step squeezes that moisture through the material, presses it against the skin, and turns your insulation into a heat sink. A boot full of wet fiber is not warm. It is a refrigerator strapped to your foot. And now all the other problems pile in. Skin softens, friction rises, blisters open, toes lose sensation, and then they lose usefulness. Cold alone hurts. Cold plus moisture dismantles the foot. That is the first big reason ancient humans needed something more than simple protection from rocks. They needed systems that could hold warmth while managing moisture. And that is a much harder problem than just tying hide around your foot. A loose wrapping can help for a while. A strip of leather can stop cuts. A skin bag can keep out some snow. But long winters ruin quick fixes. The wrapping shifts. The inside gets wet. The foot sweats. The cold bites harder. So why did humans delay true foot insulation for so long? Because before they solved feet properly, they had partial solutions. A bit of hide, dry grass stuffed around the toes, fur turned inward, bark fiber, simple wrappings around the ankle. None of that requires knitting or weaving. None of that requires civilization. You only need a bad enough day. A child comes back crying. A hunter limps into camp. Someone tears soft skin into strips, packs grass around a foot, and ties the whole thing shut before the next morning. That probably happened over and over again. Small fixes, then better ones, then combinations. But the real breakthrough was not one magical invention called the sock. It was the moment humans began thinking in layers. That matters because a foot in severe cold does not just need a shell on the outside. It needs a dry, warm microclimate on the inside, something soft against the skin, something that traps air, something removable, something that can be dried by the fire and used again tomorrow. And this is where the story gets more interesting, because socks were not really a first solution. They were a last solution. Humans did not invent serious foot insulation because they finally noticed winter. They invented it because by then they had better fire, better shelters, and better clothing. And once those problems were partly under control, the remaining weak point became impossible to ignore: feet. That is why the familiar modern idea of a shoe can actually mislead us. A shoe protects from the outside. A sock-like layer protects from the inside. In deep cold, the inside matters just as much, sometimes more. The outer boot can block snow and abrasion, but if the inside stays damp, the boot becomes a coffin for your toes. The warm part is the inner layer, the fur lining, the dry grass, the shaped wrap, the removable insert you sleep with so it does not freeze solid overnight. That was the real innovation, and solving that problem required solving a bigger one first: clothing. Once humans moved into truly cold environments, draping hides over the body was no longer enough. Loose hides help, but they leak heat, they shift while you walk, they leave gaps, they work poorly around joints and extremities. To survive full winters, humans needed clothing shaped to the body, and clothing changed because of one tiny invention: the eyed needle. By at least 40,000 years ago, in parts of Eurasia, humans were making needles fine enough for real sewing. That sounds minor until you think about what sewing actually does. Sewing turns animal skin from a blanket into a garment. It lets you fit material close to the limbs, close to the torso, close to the feet. It lets you build cuffs, pouches, liners, inner layers. Once that happens, the foot can finally be treated as its own engineering problem. Not just covered, but shaped, layered, lined, dried, and replaced when it fails. You still do not get modern socks. No knitting, no elastic cuffs, no matching pairs folded in a drawer. What you get is something older and, in that environment, just as important: foot wraps, fur liners, sewn inner boots, grass stuffing systems, soft removable layers inside tougher outer shells, sock-like, not sock-shaped. And once people had that, they could do something much bigger than stay comfortable. They could stay. That is the deeper shift. Earlier humans could enter cold places and endure them for a while. Later humans were increasingly building whole lifeways around severe cold. At that point, failing feet were no longer an inconvenience. They were a structural weakness in the entire survival system. That fits the bigger logic perfectly. First came movement into harsher climates, then better clothing. Then the discovery that better clothing did not solve everything. It exposed everything it still could not protect. There is a pattern here that shows up all through human history. Solve one problem, and the next failure point becomes obvious. Get better fire, and you can stay out longer. Get better shelters, and you can survive harsher nights. Get better clothing, and suddenly the exposed gaps matter more than ever. One of those gaps was at the end of the leg. So the invention of sock-like foot insulation was not a random comfort upgrade. It was what happened after humans had already become good enough at surviving cold to notice what was still failing. And feet are brutally unforgiving. You can tolerate a lot of misery if your legs still carry you. If your feet break down, everything else breaks with them. That is why this humble technology matters so much. The glamorous inventions get remembered: fire, spears, blades, maybe the needle if it is lucky. But a species does not spread across half the planet on glamour. It spreads on unromantic solutions, things that keep skin intact, things that preserve mobility, things that let a parent cross frozen ground with a child and still arrive with all 10 toes. So why did ancient humans suddenly need socks? Because there came a point when they were no longer just tough tropical primates pushing into cold places. They were staying there. Their feet had evolved for flexibility, grip, and heat loss in warm climates. Cold made that dangerous, and wetness made it worse. But the real twist is that socks became necessary only after other technologies had already raised the standard of survival. Once clothing improved, feet stood out. Once outer footwear improved, the inner failure became obvious. Once humans could survive the winter everywhere else, they could no longer afford to lose the battle at ground level. Not modern socks, something older. Foot wraps, fur liners, grass stuffing, sewn inner boots. Small inventions, almost invisible in the archaeological record, but enormous in consequence. Because somewhere in the Ice Age, after humans had solved just enough of the cold to keep going, they finally had to solve the part still touching the snow. On that frozen plain, she keeps walking because her feet are dry,